welcome to the 13th annual Sackler Lecture, which is being presented along with the National Academy of Sciences Sackler Colloquium on a topic that doesn't come up very often. It's the 150th anniversary of the National Academy of Sciences, and the symposium colloquium is called Celebrating Science and Service to the Nation. First, I want to recognize and thank Dame Jillian Sackler for being here tonight. It's a pleasure and great to see you, Jill. Jill has generously funded this program at the National Academy of Sciences in memory of her husband, Dr. Arthur M. Sackler. And I should say that there's a brief page that speaks about the career of Dr. Sackler in science and medicine and the arts. And it's quite inspiring, as brief as it is, and I hope you'll take a moment to look at it. We are in our 13th year, I think, of many successful programs in the Sackler Colloquium series. Each year we host a number of interdisciplinary science meetings as part of this program that usually brings together a very diverse group of scientists and people who use science, people who would normally not meet each other because they have very different interests. One of the colloquia includes this public annual lecture, so that's what this evening is. And I'm pleased that Jill Sackler could join us tonight and for the scientific meetings that convene tomorrow. There's a list of previous annual Sackler lectures also in this program. It's quite impressive. And for this program, we've also received some support from the W.M. Keck Foundation, the Ford Foundation, and the Richard Lounsbury Foundation, as I say, for this particular colloquium. This year, the Academy is celebrating its 150th anniversary. Since being founded in 1863, the Academy has, on request from the government, provided expert analysis and advice on all matters of science and technology for Congress and various federal agencies, the White House, and so forth. We've also encouraged scientific education and training, and we've represented the United States in a number of international activities, just every month virtually. During the last century and a half, the Academy has been engaged in all the central issues of science and technology and medicine, from environmental pollution through climate change, healthcare, and even terrorism. The Academy's contribution to shaping policy in these and other critical areas, and to the development of scientific and technical knowledge that undergirds all of this work, is an important story. So throughout this sesquicentennial year, we are having a number of presentations from serious analysts of what's happened over the years, how it's changed, and what we can look forward to in the future. And tonight will be a really major event. So I'm pleased to introduce Professor Daniel Kevles, who's the Stanley Woodward Professor of History at Yale University. Before going to Yale, Dan had a very productive early part of his career at Caltech in California, and he's collaborating now with a team of historians creating a book that will describe the development of science, technology, and medicine in America, and in those cases where the Academy had a role, explore that role. To do this, they've been working a lot in our archives and the records of the Academy, and they have complete editorial freedom throughout the project. So tonight, Professor Kevles will present the annual Sackler Lecture, and he will speak about his thoughts so far on the National Academy in the American democracy. Dan, it's a pleasure to welcome you to the podium.
Thank you, Ralph. Thanks to all of you for coming. Thanks to the Academy for sponsoring this, and to Dame Sackler for her generosity in the support of this annual symposium. On arriving at the Academy this afternoon, I noticed in the brochure a statement of purpose of the Sackler Colloquia, and it is a kind of institutionalization, if you will, of the faith in communication as the prime mover of knowledge and culture. I'm grateful to the Academy, as are my collaborators in the Sesquicentennial History Project, for interpreting that admonition by committing this year's Sackler to history. If you look through the list of previous speakers, you will see this. I think this is the first such enterprise, and I hope that you will find it worthwhile. It's valuable to interrogate the past for its own sake. I ask you to contemplate just for a few microseconds what you would think about yourselves and your place in the world if you knew nothing about what happened before the day before yesterday. And if you do want to know something about what happened before the day before yesterday, wouldn't you like it to be reliable knowledge and accurate rather than simply a constructed myth without any foundation? So it's valuable to interrogate the past for its own sake, but also to help comprehend the present and perhaps to help chart our way to the future. And this is especially the case in the history of science and technology and of this distinguished institution, precisely because of the paramount role that science, technology, and medicine have played in shaping the world that we live in and will even more so shape the world that is to come. So, to the past. In 1863, Congress, as you know, created the National Academy of Sciences as a private agency with the public role of advising the government on policy-related technical issues. The prime movers behind the action were Harvard's Louis Agassiz. I'm sorry, I forgot to turn on my mic. Here we go. Harvard's Louis Agassiz, a native of Switzerland, and a brilliant student of rocks, and you see him up here on your right. And the geophysicist Alexander Dallas Bache, who is Benjamin Franklin's great-grandson, the head of the Coast Survey, and an authority on terrestrial magnetism. Agassiz, the academic, saw in a national academy an institution that would raise the quality of science in the United States by granting the imprimatur of membership not to men of mere learning, but only to men of original scientific achievement. Bache, the longtime federal scientist, felt the need for an institution of authoritative scientists that would safeguard public policy making in an increasingly technical age from charlatans and pretenders. Like the French Academy of Sciences, which provided the model for the two men, the U.S. National Academy would choose its own membership and be limited to 50 members. Agassiz, elected the first foreign secretary, was thrilled, holding that the nation's men of science now had, as he put it, a standard for scientific excellence. Bache was elected the first president. During the 5 years of his administration, which ended with his death in 1867, the Academy received 13 requests from the federal government for advice on topics ranging from assessments of weights, measures, and coinage to the insulation of ships' compasses, from the influence of iron cladding, and on to tests for the purity of whiskey. There were several such studies in the later 19th century. Agassiz and Bache had gone behind the back of their friend, the physicist Joseph Henry, to achieve their goal. Henry, as many of you may know, was a world-class authority on magnetism and then the secretary of the Smithsonian Institution. He had opposed the creation of this institution, suspecting that an academy might be considered, as he put it, at variance with our democratic institutions, and might become, again, to use his words, perverted to the support of partisan politics. Henry was at first far from pleased by the coup pulled off by his friends Bache and Agassiz, but he accepted membership in the Academy, and upon Bache's death, the Academy's presidency. He kept the Academy scrupulously out of politics, establishing the tradition that the Academy would not volunteer its services to the government. Perhaps this explains why during the 10 years of his term, the government made only 2 requests for advice, compared with the 13 previous. To put the Academy more in line with American democratic institutions, Henry obtained a removal of the membership ceiling so that 5 new scientists could be elected each year. He had come to think that an intelligent democracy, as he put it, could properly bestow honors for achievement, and the creation of the Academy had opened in America another avenue for the aspirations of a laudable ambition. For most of its first half-century, however, a variety of circumstances militated against the Academy's fulfilling its twin goals of stimulating the development of American science and providing reliable scientific advice to the government. While it was common for European academies to receive subsidies from their governments, the U.S. National Academy, in its determination to avoid political corruption, sought and received none. Its financial resources were severely limited, insufficient to publish more than an occasional proceedings and obituaries of its members. The Academy met in the Smithsonian, having no headquarters of its own. Here is a typical meeting from the 1870s. And the meetings, as you can see here, tended to be poorly attended. Part of the audience here are the wives of the members. Could an honorific body without resources have an impact on the life of American science, people wondered? No, said Leo Lescura, a paleobotanist who had moved from Europe to the United States. He said, in Europe, honor conferred is worth more than money, but in America, the same honor is worth nothing by itself. Then, too, alternative avenues were proliferating for the satisfaction of laudable scientific ambitions in this country. The nation's scientific enterprise was rapidly expanding in tandem with the growth of the country. To meet the need for knowledge, federal science grew enormously, proliferating with agencies such as the U.S. Geological Survey, the Weather Service, the Forestry Service, the National Bureau of Standards, the Department of Agriculture's multiple research bureaus, and the experiment stations it supported around the country. This was all in the half-century before World War I. Comparable and then even greater growth was prompted in the private and academic sectors by what historians call the Second Industrial Revolution. This was the transformation that drew on the exploitation of the laboratory sciences to create new technologies and new industries, notably in electric light and power, communications, cinema, petroleum, and the myriad other products of organic chemistry. A number of companies early in the 20th century, notably GE, AT&T, Westinghouse, and DuPont, established industrial research laboratories, enlarging the demand for technical expertise. That demand called forth the beginning of what would prove to be a long exponential enlargement and diversification of the American scientific, engineering, and medical communities. The desire to understand and to manage the new urban industrial order helped energize the growth of sociology, anthropology, and economics. And as the new disciplines grew, they organized, forming an abundance of specialized scientific societies in the half-century after the founding of the Academy. I put them up here not to read them, but to let you read them so that you can get a sense of at least a sampling of all these societies formed in that period. All these societies happily bypassed the Academy, some deliberately. For example, the American Physical Society was founded in 1899 at the initiative of a physicist at Clark University named Arthur Gordon Webster. He resented the Academy, to which, as he put it, few of us can hope to belong, and which we might not enjoy if we did. For Webster, as for scientists in other disciplines, their professional societies provided non-exclusive forums where scientists could hear papers by the leading members in their field at will. These developments undercut the Academy's twin purposes. Unlike the Academy, most of the specialized societies published journals, spun off local sections, and established systems of awards and recognition, all of which made them a force in the disciplines they represented. Their members were enlisted by federal and state agencies to provide expert assessments on the multiplying issues of high technology society, including, for example, conservation, the purity of food and drugs, and the regulation of the financial and industrial system. And by the early 20th century, there were plenty of experts to provide similar services in the federal government's own agencies. Withal, the National Academy's advisory activity steadily declined. In the 10 years between 1879 and 1888, the Academy had received 10 requests for advice from the government. In the 23 years between 1890 and 1913, it received 8, including none in the 4 years after 1909. In contrast to the collective panoply of the specialized societies, the Academy was relatively ill-equipped to play a significant role in helping the federal government deal with the great questions involving science and technology then increasingly confronting the United States. Even though it had doubled the election of new members each year to 10, its exclusiveness continued to arouse resentment among other scientists, with some non-members regarding it as, quote, a menace to true democracy, as one of the members said. It was largely disconnected from the Second Industrial Revolution, having repeatedly declined to admit engineers, even Edison himself, and from the rise of the regulatory state, having no social scientists among its ranks, and from the mounting requirements of medicine and public health, having hardly any representatives of scientific medicine on its rolls. In the unhappy judgment of a very distinguished biologist at Princeton, who was a member of the Academy, the membership generally preferred to continue as a mere blue ribbon society, in his phrase. Right around the time of the First World War, however, a remarkable man named George Ellery Hale intended to change all that. Make no small plans, Hale liked to say. He was an accomplished astrophysicist. He was even more effective at scientific entrepreneurship. In 1904, Hale persuaded Andrew Carnegie, you see Hale on the right and Carnegie on the left. He persuaded Carnegie to fund the Mount Wilson Observatory. Hale's entrepreneurial vision increasingly extended beyond astrophysics to turning the National Academy, of which he was the foreign secretary, into a vital agency in the affairs of national science. Hale endorsed increasing the limit on annual elections to 15, and he called for the Academy to cooperate with local and national societies, an initiative that would mitigate the exclusionist objection to it. He also urged that the Academy enlarge its influence by dispensing money for research, particularly to promising young men, publishing a proceedings, and acquiring a building, a permanent meeting home with lectures and exhibits that would be open to the public. All this would, of course, take money. To that end, Hale thought that American science in general and the Academy in particular needed to promote greater public appreciation and financial support of research, especially from industry and industrialists. But both his attempts at fundraising, which failed, and his study of science in Europe had taught Hale a critical lesson, to wit, and to quote him, to accomplish great results, academies had to enjoy the active cooperation of the leaders of the state. Hale held, in short, that the Academy's major twin purposes of advancing American science and advising the government were mutually interdependent and had to be symbiotically joined far more than they already were. Hale's opportunity came precisely with World War I. Events in May 1915 made dramatically clear that more than any other conflict in history, this was a war of science and technology. That month, May 1915, the Germans initiated chemical warfare by unleashing chlorine gas from hundreds of cylinders on the front at Ypres in Belgium. And that month, a German U-boat sank the Lusitania. Both American scientists and the administration of Woodrow Wilson were appalled by the use of poison gas, and neither proposed a program of even defensive research in chemical warfare. Hale wrote to the president, for example, of course, we would never want to do research in chemical warfare. But American shipping was now clearly vulnerable to the depredations of German submarines, whether the nation was at war or not. Shortly after the sinking of the Lusitania, Secretary of the Navy Josephus Daniels established a naval consulting board headed by Thomas Edison to use, as Daniels' announcement put it, the natural inventive genius of Americans to meet the new conditions of warfare. And here you see Edison in the middle. The board's membership was drawn overwhelmingly from the country's major engineering organizations and included only two scientists. One a physicist, the other a mathematician, both as representatives of, not of a strictly scientific organization, but of the American Mathematical Society. Early in October, at the board's first meeting, the physicist demanded to know why Edison had omitted the American Physical Society. Edison's chief engineer responded, explaining, because it was his desire to have this board composed of practical men who are accustomed to doing things and not talking about it. A few minutes later, the physicist returned to his theme. Why hadn't the National Academy been represented on the board? Possibly, the inventor Peter Cooper Hewitt speculated, provoking laughter, because they have not been sufficiently active to impress their existence upon Mr. Edison's mind. George Ellery Hale was thoroughly irritated by the announcement of the board's membership and the exclusion of all scientists. He wondered, could not the Academy's reputation be raised to the point where it might penetrate to the sanctum of the Secretary of the Navy? Hale shared the members' traditional wariness of thrusting the Academy upon the government, but after all, this was a national emergency, and in such a state, they could properly offer its services to the administration without appearing to be behaving like mere political supplicants. They did just that, and in June 1916, following a meeting with President Wilson and a formal presidential request for assistance, the Academy created the National Research Council, the NRC. The NRC's objective was to encourage both pure and applied research for the ultimate end of the national security and welfare. Its strategy was to promote cooperation among the research institutions of the country. Its planned composition was to be leading scientists and engineers from universities, industry, and the government, including the military. Many scientific societies, research foundations, and universities quickly pledged their cooperation to the NRC. And so did a number of industrial leaders, especially those from the emerging high-tech corporate world. When in April 1917, the United States entered the European conflict, Hale declared, war should mean research, and unless we get it started, some other agency will do so. But the NRC had little money of its own, and as a creature of the Academy, it remained a resolutely private organization with no authority in the government. It had to operate by argument and persuasion, making use of its members' connections in industry and government and philanthropy. The key persuader was Robert A. Millikan, a likable and energetic physicist, and you see here, second from the left, and a future Nobel laureate for the work he had done in 1910 on measuring the charge on the electron and showing that every electron is identical. Then at the University of Chicago, Millikan was a consultant and a supplier of trained physicists to Western Electric and AT&T. And indeed, one of his students, Frank B. Jewett, later rose to the top of the company, and he will figure in our story a little later on. The company valued him highly, that is Jewett, valued Millikan highly for his expertise in figuring out the intricacies of the vacuum tubes it was developing with the aim of amplifying telephone signals so that they would reach from one side of the continent to the other. And the first demonstration of transcontinental telephony was in 1915. Millikan effectively straddled the worlds of academia and high-tech industry, and he was effective at working with officers in the military's technical bureaus. Now, why is he in uniform? Since the NRC had neither governmental authority nor significant funds, its officers accomplished the mobilization of science by enlisting in the military or going to work as civilians in federal laboratories, some of which were taken over by the military. Millikan himself became a colonel in the U.S. Army. Led by Millikan, the NRC joined with other Army and Navy officers to inaugurate research and production for high-quality optical glass, drawing heavily upon the substantial expertise of scientists at the Geophysical Laboratory at the Carnegie Institution of Washington, and to develop intelligence tests for the assessment and placement of the Army's 1.7 million recruits. This was the first large-scale use of IQ testing in the United States. Under the auspices of the NRC, the Bureau of Mines launched a program of research in chemical weapons, the distinction between offensive and defensive chemical warfare having disappeared once American soldiers were committed to fight in France. By May of 1918, the Bureau had farmed out problems to 21 university laboratories. And all the while, Millikan himself wrestled with approaches to the detection of submarines with a considerable sense of urgency. The detection of submarines, he declared, was, after all, only a problem of physics, pure and simple. The detection of submarines and of other instruments of war was accomplished basically by passive acoustics during World War I. In a sense, this physicist part of the war was an acoustic war, unlike the radar war that would come in World War II. Here is a binaural submarine detector that goes through a ship's hull. The operator would simply turn the top. There were rubber bulbs and then tubes, and it would be like turning your head. And then when the sound was a maximum, he would know that he was facing its source. And he would listen through that stethoscope. And then airplanes were detected in fundamentally the same way. There is 18-foot horns for locating invisible aircraft devised by an NRC subcommittee on physics. Soon the NRC became the sole agency in Washington that straddled every scientific constituency. Industrialists working together with the Millikans and numerous agencies and committees learned that academics could be, in fact, hard-headed administrators and could treat technical matters with a practicality worthy of an Edison. By Hale's reports, the close contact of the NRC with federal and industrial officials was winning many new friends for pure science. In March 1918, Hale moved to make the council and its governmental connections permanent by obtaining an executive order for this purpose from President Woodrow Wilson. Hale himself wrote the draft of the order. It provided, among other things, that the NRC would continue to foster cooperative efforts in research in the government as well as in the private sector. That raised a red flag with Wilson. Wilson doubted, as he put it, his right to give any outside body the power to coordinate the scientific work of the government. Wilson, in fact, modified the draft order with the help of his Secretary of Agriculture, who was a political scientist, so as to ensure that the NRC, being a private organization, would not have any authority over federal scientific agencies and programs. Issued in May 11, 1918, on May 11, 1918, the final order asked the Academy to perpetuate the National Research Council. It also explicitly provided for future U.S. presidents to appoint to it federal representatives nominated by the Academy, which assured the Council the continuing participation of the leaders of the state without their interference. Hale, who was principally concerned with what could be done for science outside the federal establishment, elatedly declared, "We now have precisely the connection with the government that we need," and he intended to make good use of it to promote American science. The connection with the state did not, for Hale or any of his peers, include ambitions for public funding. Hale and his allies feared that public funding would open the door to distasteful supervision or perhaps tyranny. He would not be disappointed, he said, if we have to rely on private funds for a long period in the future. The Academy proceeded forthwith to solidify its connections with industry in 1919 by finally creating a section for men who had contributed to the science or art of engineering. Now, with its admirable war record and its extensive connections through the NRC to the multiple sectors of basic science and engineering, the Academy obtained private funds in abundance. The Carnegie Corporation, which had turned down Hale in 1915, provided operating money for several years, and then it granted the NAS-NRC $5 million, which was a fortune in 1919, about a third for what became the Academy's building here on Constitution Avenue, the rest for the operations of the NAS-NRC. The NRC rapidly developed into an intellectually expansive operating arm of the Academy, doing much that with the Academy's limited membership and disciplinary diversity, the Academy itself was ill-equipped to do. The NRC established 13 interdisciplinary divisions, among them divisions of biology and agriculture, of engineering, and of anthropology and psychology. The divisions in turn spawned multiple committees. Among those with high impact were the Committee on Research in Sex and Reproduction, whose activities led to the Kinsey reports eventually, on industrial lighting, which unexpectedly yielded the striking result of the Hawthorne effect, which most of you probably know about, but for those of you who don't, it was to study how lighting affected the productivity of labor people working in, I think it was General Electric's plant in Hawthorne, Massachusetts. And what they discovered was that no matter how they changed the lighting, even going back to the original lighting, productivity kept going up. And the interpretation of the phenomenon was that what counted was not the lighting, but that somebody was paying attention to the people who were building the lamps. The NRC committees also worked on highway research, which helped shape the design of the nation's rapidly expanding roads. Other committees spoke to some of the day's other salient science-related issues, dealing with drug addiction, medicine, and physics and nutrition. The new and handsome funding also equipped the Academy to play a far more significant role in the development of basic science, starting with the publication of its proceedings. The Rockefeller Foundation established a program of postdoctoral fellowships that was administered by the NAS-NRC and that would prove to have a huge impact on raising the quality of American science between the wars and beyond. All the while, the NRC created a set of committees to consider major problems in various scientific disciplines and call attention to them by publishing comprehensive bulletins. One of them being, for example, John Van Vleck's very influential Quantum Principles and Line Spectra in the late 20s. Although President Calvin Coolidge, whom you see here in the center, addressed the Academy at the building's dedication in 1924, the NAS-NRC still received hardly any requests for scientific advice from the government. In 1931, a committee appointed to look into the issue noted that the Academy had not been taken seriously by the government and attributed the problem in part to the rule that it speaks only when spoken to. Amid the emergence of the Great Depression, however, the Academy decided once again to be proactive, as Hale had done in World War I. It obtained an executive order from President Franklin Roosevelt to establish a scientific advisory board for 2 years, beginning in 1933, that would operate under the auspices of the NAS-NRC. Chaired by the physicist Carl T. Compton, the president of MIT, it was to report on how science and technology could contribute to the amelioration of the economy and the operations of federal science. In December 1934, the board proposed a major program, to wit, a federal appropriation for research of $75 million for 5 years, justified on grounds that new knowledge would lead to new industries, new jobs, and a boost to economic recovery. The proposal, nevertheless, was virtually dead on arrival in the administration for 2 reasons. First, the board was undercut by internecine warfare between Compton and the president of the Academy, William Wallace Campbell, a former head of the University of California. Campbell objected to the very existence of the board because, even though it was operating in the Academy, its membership had been appointed by President Franklin Roosevelt. Campbell alienated members of the administration by complaining repeatedly about FDR's violation of the Academy's apolitical autonomy. So Compton took it upon himself to pay Campbell a visit in California to try to work things out. Compton found Campbell absolutely adamant. In Compton's recollection of the meeting, Compton, blew up, writing that the Academy and Campbell could be, quote, damned if they were going to insist on such trivialities and legalities in preference to grasping the opportunity to do a great public service. The second reason was more substantive and, I think, important. The proposed appropriation for research failed because the board declined to accept normal democratic oversight and accountability, insisting instead on autonomy in the allocation of the research money. The administration, on its part, refused to appropriate what one official termed a large free fund for projects that were not socially purposeful. Indeed, the economic payoff from the federal investment in long-term basic research would obviously come in the vaguely distant future. And in the view of the administration, people needed relief, economic relief in the here and now. The board's program reminded one key administration staffer of what we call trickle-down economics, an approach to recovery that amounted, as the staffer put it, Herbert Hoover's point of view. So nothing came directly from the board's efforts, but the experience gave several of its members, notably Compton and Frank B. Jewett, the head of Bell Labs, who would become the president of the Academy in 1939, a basic education in federal science policy making that would shape their approach to the mobilization of science in the coming war. The key mobilizer, of course, was Compton's former MIT colleague, Vannevar Bush. He was a very distinguished electrical engineer, a key pioneer in the second generation of electric light and power in this country, and then in the 30s he had moved on into the early development of computers, and here he is with what is called his differential analyzer. But apart from his scientific work, Bush was a veteran of a branch of the NRC submarine detection effort in World War I that had operated at New London, Connecticut, under the control of the Navy. He had chafed while there at such control because it prevented the civilian scientists and engineers from pursuing innovative research in military devices that might make sense to them, but did not necessarily make sense to the naval officers. He believed that if science for defense was to be organized effectively and on the leading edge, the cutting edge of possibility, it had to be done independently of the military, under the wing of the President of the United States, not through the Academy. I interviewed Bush when he was in retirement once in Massachusetts, and he said to me, I knew that you could not get anything done in that damn town, meaning here, unless you organized it under the wing of the president. Bush had no trouble in listening to this view, either Compton, given his experience with William Wallace Campbell in the episode of the Science Advisory Board, or Jewett, who had met Bush in the submarine warfare laboratory at New London, Connecticut during World War I, and having been a member of the Academy since 1918, was more steeped in its traditions, including its tradition of not proactively approaching the government. Jewett thought that an agency other than the NAS would have to mobilize and direct defense research. As he put it, the NAS was properly like a doctor waiting for clients. It could not act as an aggressive salesman, hawking its expertise for military purposes. To do so, he thought, would turn the Academy into just another agency of government and destroy its most valuable asset, which in his terms was the authority of distinction without power. Besides, he rightly recognized that the job of mobilizing science and technology for World War II was just too big a job for the National Academy and the NRC. So with the support of Compton, Jewett, and also James B. Conant, the chemist, president of Harvard, and also another scientific veteran of World War I, Bush prevailed upon President Roosevelt in June 1940 to establish the National Defense Research Committee, or NDRC, and then in June 1941, the Office of Scientific Research and Development, or OSRD, which included the NDRC. And here is Jewett. Now, what we have here is a kind of gang of 4 or 5 or 6 who ran the mobilization of science, guided it, and technology during World War II. Together with Arthur Holly Compton, they comprised Ernest Lawrence on the left, the head of the radiation laboratory at Berkeley. Arthur Holly Compton, second from the left, who was Carl's brother and himself a distinguished physicist, a Nobel laureate, as in fact. Bush, third from left, then Carl Compton, and then I believe that's Alfred L. Loomis, who is a patron of physics and a physicist practitioner himself. He made a fortune in the financial markets, selling out at the right time before the crash, and in the front, James B. Conant. They comprise, these men, the core of the wartime scientific directorate, if you want to call it that or think of it that way. The work of OSRD itself helped mightily to achieve the stunning and decisive technical successes of World War II, from microwave radar through the atomic bomb, which started out after its false start in OSRD before it became the Manhattan Project. Both NDRC and OSRD were, of course, agencies of government, but both were authorized to obtain assistance in their work from the NAS, that is the Academy and the Research Council. And obtain it they did, as did other federal agencies. During the war, the Academy and Research Council provided multiple advisory and administrative services to the scientific mobilization on issues ranging from surveying the availability of scientific personnel in the nation's colleges and universities to assessing the feasibility of going ahead with a project to produce an atomic bomb. The Academy signed 34 war-related contracts with 10 federal agencies. Its building here on Constitution Avenue was occupied by several divisions of the NDRC, by the whole of the OSRD Committee on Medical Research, and by some 20 other groups with war contracts from NDRC. Every nook and cranny of the building was laced with partition offices, and when more spaces were needed, they simply divided the partitions into 2. After the war, the leadership and the membership of the NAS-NRC understood that there was no going back, no returning to the era when the Academy's functions comprised, as one scientist put it, electing members and writing obituaries. Nor should there be such a going back, many members realized, given the essential importance of science to national security and the importance of avoiding the divorce of academic and industrial science and engineering from the military that had followed World War I. But under what arrangements was the Academy still an insistently private organization to serve national security in the post-war world? At first, it must be said, the Academy overreached itself, much as Hale had done in framing the executive order for the continuation of the NRC in 1918. The overreach took the form of a move to establish in the NAS-NRC a research board for national security that would conduct defense research for the armed services. Harold Smith, director of the Budget Bureau, had warned Franklin Roosevelt in March 1945 that the Academy was, in Smith's words, very jealous of its non-governmental status, and under its control, the Research Board for National Security would work on weapons of war, but inappropriately not be responsible to the Commander-in-Chief. The proposal, it should be no surprise to you, the proposal for the Research Board for National Security failed. But the Academy was of no mind to withdraw from engagement with the government simply because it could not have that engagement on its own terms. On the contrary, Jewett, in recognition of the wartime experience and now the looming Cold War, abandoned the policy that the NAS could act only when called upon, could speak only when spoken to, and his successors also vigorously embraced and indeed advanced that proactivism. In the post-war years, the NAS-NRC provided an increasing number of advisory and administrative services to the government, with significant boosts in both occurring during the Korean War and in the several years after Sputnik in 1957. The efforts ranged from inner space, that is oceanography, to the sciences of outer space, from studies on the long-term health effects of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki to inquiries on food and nutrition. All of the participants in these studies, through either the Academy or the NRC, served without compensation, as all had done since the founding of the Academy in 1863. It was a major contribution in time, brains, and effort to the well-being of the United States. Throughout the period, the Academy also continued to promote science, for example, administering the NSF Fellowship Program and sponsoring the landmark conference at Shelter Island in 1947, where, among other things, Willis Lamb reported his unexpected spectral shift, and Richard Feynman first publicly discussed his remarkable diagrams. Between 1945 and 1960, the Academy and Research Council budget more than quintupled to over $14 million. The Academy's entanglement with the government at times strained its principles, it must be said, notably in the post-war decade when considerations of loyalty and security threatened the civil liberties of scientists. For example, in 1947, the physicist Edward U. Condon, the head of the National Bureau of Standards, was pilloried for his left-leaning politics by the House Un-American Activities Committee, particularly by its chairman, Congressman J. Parnell Thomas. Frank Jewett deplored the HUAC's actions, and so did many other members of the Academy. A number wanted the Academy to take a strong public stand, but the Council of the Academy, including Vannevar Bush and the then president of the Academy, A.N. Richards, was very reluctant to do so. The most unfortunate outcome would be to jeopardize our relations with the government, Richards said. In the end, the Academy confined itself publicly to a tepid expression of, quote, grave concern over HUAC's treatment of Condon. A few years later, however, in January 1955, the Academy courageously issued a report that ended security restrictions on most federally funded fellowships, declaring that no one should be denied a fellowship for work in unclassified research solely on grounds of allegations of disloyalty. In all, during the post-war years, the Academy richly realized the twin purposes that Alexander Dallas Bache and Louis Agassiz had established for it, that is, advancing science and serving the government. If George Hale had recognized that the two were symbiotically linked, his post-war successors, that is post-World War II successors, did so even more. In 1961, the Academy fortified, or in the early 60s, the Academy fortified the link by creating its Committee on Science and Public Policy, or COSPUP, C-O-S-P-U-P, acronymically. COSPUP took the initiative without waiting for requests from the government to report on important and promising directions for future scientific research and in the applications of science to critical public problems. Its reports span topics from basic research and national goals to a 10-year program for ground-based astronomy. President John F. Kennedy perhaps helped inspire the creation of COSPUP. When addressing the Academy in April 1961, he spoke of the many new frontiers of science and of his conviction that never before, even in World War II, had there been a time when the relationship between science and government must be more intimate. By then, after a century of experience in the American democracy, the Academy had by and large, not perfectly, but by and large, worked out arrangements to insulate itself from political control while at the same time serving a government that insisted on oversight and accountability. The relationship had at times been uneasy, but when President Kennedy returned to speak at the Academy's centennial in 1963, he found it worthy of admiration, and so, I think, can we. Thank you. I'll be glad to take any questions, hostile, supportive, whatever. No questions. What was it?
Very small question.
Pardon?
An opening statement.
I can't. Oh, yeah, Jerry.
Very small question.
An opening statement that the model was the French Academy. Another possibility would have been the Royal Society. What was the reason for the one rather than the other?
Because Louis Agassiz was Swiss. Because Louis Agassiz was Swiss. And he was a devotee of the academies on the continent, especially the French Academy.
In 1863, the Russian fleet came to New York and San Francisco.
I'm sorry, I can't understand you.
1863, it was the Civil War, right?
Yes.
And the Russian fleet, Alexander II, he sent the fleet to America, to San Francisco and to New York City. So it was Russian-American relations. I'm a Russian scholar, and I have a question. Can you compare, for example, because Russia had the Academy of Sciences too, but can you compare, for example, the scientific relations between two academies?
Between the two academies?
Yeah.
I think you will hear something about that in the next 2 days. I'm not intimately familiar with it. I will tell you, though, that part of the inspiration for my collaborators, Ruth Cowan and Peter Westwick, along with me, of getting involved with writing the sesquicentennial history of the Academy, was our preliminary exploration of the archives here. They are very, very rich, and they include remarkably informative memoranda, reports, and so on, letters, on the visits to the Soviet Union by members of the National Academy during the, I think, the 1960s, maybe earlier. And you will probably hear more about that later. But as I recall, what I read of the documents, and that was almost 2 years ago, is that the Americans were very impressed by the prowess of Soviet science. That was not the first time that members of the American scientific community went to the Soviet Union. They went in the 30s, especially those who were left-leaning. They came away very disillusioned, I might say, by Stalinism. But then during the war, they went again, just about at the end of the war, I think right after the end of the war, to write a report on the strengths and weaknesses and possibilities in Soviet science, and they came away very impressed and recommended through what became UNESCO that the West, starting with the United States, should seek as much friendship and collaboration with Soviet scientists. Then, of course, the Cold War intervened and things got very chilly. But by the 1960s, probably with the precedent of the, what's the name of the effort to, no, the American scientists and Soviet scientists would, Pugwash, right, with the effort of Pugwash, the precedent of Pugwash, they began to try to establish relations again. But so that is part of the Academy's history. I can't tell you more in detail about it now.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You can tell us what you know from your side. Yes.
Yeah, so you talked about how for much of the history of the Academy was passive.
The Academy was what?
Passive, sort of not speaking unless you have spoken.
Right.
So do you think that was a reflection of the makeup of the members of the Academy, or do you think it was sort of the Academy's view of where they stood and how science was viewed in America?
Well, that's a very good question. There is a long-standing cultural tradition in science, and certainly in this country and in other countries as well, that science is apolitical, should be as such, that it's disinterested and should be committed only to the exposure of truth, and that if it's to be involved in policy, policy should be based on facts, evidence-based policy, as we say these days. So the Academy institutionalized that tradition. The first members, even though many of them were in government, in fact, the majority of the Academy's membership were people in federal science, because that's where most of the action was in the later 19th century. Even though they were in government, they strongly believed that the Academy should remain at arm's length from the political process. So it's not unique to the Academy that this commitment to a kind of apolitical science, and that the scientific enterprise should not be seen as a supplicant for money or power. But the price of that was that the government, by and large, didn't pay any attention to them for much of the first half century, and then even up through 1939, 1940. Does that answer your question? I could go on all night about this, but that's the short answer. Yes.
Great. Thank you for your lecture tonight. I have two questions for you. The first is, I was very struck by one of your opening images, which is of the wives of the scientists helping to populate the Smithsonian. And I'm just sort of curious about how has the NAS included women over time, and how has their presence and or absence changed and impacted the NAS? So that's my first question. And then my second question sort of refers back to the previous one, which is, I was sort of struck also by the statement that the government is seen as a perverting force.
The government what?
How the government has been seen as a perverting force, as you pointed out. But I'm also sort of curious now if the conversation has shifted to how industry, or how that conversation, how industry also serves as a polluting force in many ways, how that conversation has also been mediated by the NAS over time.
Well, for the second question, I think we have to leave it to the next couple of days, because there will be, some of the panels will be devoted to, in part to industrial, technological, engineering relationships, and it doesn't really figure in the first century, except during war, by and large. As to your first question, that's an excellent question. I think that there were no women in the Academy until Alice Hamilton was elected in 1919 or 1920, 21. She was a major figure in environmental and occupational health with a focus on disease. But she was the exception that proved the rule. I'm not familiar with the gender breakdown in the history of the Academy in any detail, but I'm pretty sure that if there were any more besides Alice Hamilton, it was no more than a handful in the first century. I think that the work of but one has to recognize also that the overwhelming work of the Academy was done by the NRC rather than the Academy. The Academy was just too small to do all the work that people were asking it to do, and with all those divisions. So what we need to do is to find out who were on those committees, who served on those committees that, for example, dealt with sex and reproduction, who were on the committees that dealt with food and nutrition, who were on the committees that dealt with occupational health and safety, and so on. It may be that there were more women than many more women than there were in the Academy, though one has to be prepared by the fact that, in recognition of the fact that there weren't that many women in those areas in all of American science and engineering anyway. So I think that probably it's the case that some subjects the Academy did not take up because there were so few women in it and in its policymaking councils. And then when it did take them up, it may or may not have turned to women. So it's a great research subject, and it's one we'll be dealing with in the sesquicentennial history. Gender and the Academy is is in that pantheon of major subjects for us. Yes.
You mentioned that at the beginning of the 20th century that only 8 or 10 queries had come into the Academy for information in a decade. And I was wondering if those statistics are still kept today and if you know how many come in yearly.
Oh, Ralph, you can answer that. How many? I'm sure that it's almost more than you can count. 250, President Cicerone says, per year, right? Right. It's huge now. And the Academy, even in the period I discussed after World War II, the Academy and the Research Council together had several thousand people working on its various committees, sections, and so on. Yes,
Hi,
Angela.
that was a fascinating lecture, and you may or may not know the answer to this, but I'm curious as to how the founding of expert bodies within the executive branch, the President's Office for Science and Technology, and for the time that the Office of Technology Assessment existed within the legislative branch, how that changed the relationship of the NAS to the federal government as a source of expert opinion.
Well, that's an excellent question. I didn't have time to mention this in my remarks, but after World War II, for the first time, the Academy, a committee of Congress asked the Academy for advice. That was the Dario Subcommittee on Science and Technology in the House. And the Academy did provide 2 important reports. I forget when the OTA was established, but it's exemplary of the fact that advisory bodies to agencies of government, including the Congress, have proliferated since the 19th century, all right, which helped diminish the need for turning to the Academy in certain sense. The sense is that if you want to know something that's purely technical and relatively non-controversial, like what time next year will the sun rise on December 3rd, you can do that in your own agency without controversy. But if you want scientific advice that may be controversial and where there are vested interests in your own agency, then people would be inclined to turn to the Academy. So one of the interesting tasks for assessing or recounting the sesquicentennial history is, given the proliferation, I mean the enormous proliferation of the federal agency's own scientific advisory boards. That you can see it in defense, the Atomic Energy Commission with its General Advisory Board committee, the Advisory Committee on Naval Research, and on and on and on, right? the space, in space, the space program, et cetera. How is the, why do people turn to the Academy when they have all this expertise? And it's very high-powered expertise, right? A number of those advisory boards after the Second World War were populated by members of the Academy. Okay, so what role does the Academy play? Did the Academy play in this complicated matrix of the proliferation of these independent science advisory boards? We don't really know much about that, and it's a great subject for us to find out about. So thank you for raising it. Yes, Alan.
Is there a statement of mission for the either?
Is there what? I'm sorry.
A statement of mission in the Academy, and did it change on science literacy as a public good, and then science manpower as a national resource? Did the Academy take that as part of its?
Well, this Academy has certainly, right from the Second World, well, I mean, tacitly from the time of the First World, right after the First World War, the creation of the NRC postdoctoral fellowships, whose consequence you know very well. The Academy was concerned with generating more high-quality scientific people in the United States. During the Second World War, one of the first things the Academy did, and a major part of what it did during the Second World War in assistance to OSRD and NDRC was to establish a kind of infrastructural knowledge for the management and of the mobilization. Okay, so one of the first things it did, way back about 1939, well, 1940, 41, was to establish what became the Office of Scientific Personnel in the Academy. It conducted surveys of all American colleges and universities about their research facilities. It conducted similar surveys of industry. It conducted additional surveys about people. Whom have you got? What do they do? What can we know about them, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, scientific personnel, manpower, if you will, person power, that has been a concern of the Academy from then, certainly tacitly after World War I and explicitly beginning with the mobilization of World War II. Vis-a-vis science literacy, and that's part of science education, and we're devoting a whole session to that on the second day of this symposium. But that has been a major concern of the Academy as well, as you will see if you come to that. Robin?
Yes, thank you. You talk more or less sketch some of the milestones in the first 100 years of the Academy's existence, and from your vantage point in the archives, I wonder what you might suggest on a preliminary basis are some of the major milestones in the last 50 years.
Come to the next 2 days.
I will be, thank you.
I don't know. I haven't thought about that. I was pretty absorbed with just trying to cover the 101st century in 50 minutes. Yes, any more questions? These are all excellent questions. Thank you so much, and thank you for coming.